welcome to day 4 of the 2023 U.S. Media Literacy Week, a time each year when we celebrate the incredible work being done in media literacy education. We challenge ourselves to learn more about media literacy, and we work together to spread the news that media literacy is indeed more important than ever. I am Michelle Chula-Lipkin. I am NAMLE's Executive Director, and I'm honored to be moderating the next session entitled Media Literacy and Democracy, an Essential Partnership. We all know that a healthy democracy requires that its citizens have access to reliable information and the skills to analyze and evaluate that information. And this conversation will explore the many different ways in which media literacy and democracy intersect. The conversation we are going to have over the next hour is anchored here. Media literacy is essential for everyone in today's media-saturated world. Nearly all careers now require some level of media literacy. Media literacy is also vital for effective participation in civic life. Today, to be democracy ready, all students must be media literate. Couldn't agree more. So I'm excited to have some incredible people here to talk on this topic. We do have a little change in our schedule with Abby Kisa joining us for Circle because Sarah, unfortunately, is not feeling well, but we are still going to bring you a wonderful conversation. We're going to run the hour a little bit different because the experts today here all do really different work, and we want to make sure that we're giving each person and the work that they do a moment to talk and see how their particular work intersects with media literacy education. So we're splitting this hour into 4. We're going to have 4 15-minute segments, with the final segment bringing everyone together for some discussion and Q&A. So I'm super excited to introduce our first panelist, or guest, I should say, Amy Cohen, who is the Executive Director. Hello, Amy. The Executive Director of the National Association of State Election Directors, or NASED. Thank you so much for being here, Amy. And obviously, you know, I'm a huge fan of you and the work that you do every single day. So let's start with the foundation, with the basics. Tell me what NASED does and who your members are.
Well, thanks, Michelle, and I am really grateful to be here and for the work that we've done together. So the National Association of State Election Directors is a nonprofit, nonpartisan membership association, and my members are in all 50 states, DC, and the 5 US territories. So in the 40 states where a Secretary of State or Lieutenant Governor serves as the chief election official, which is sort of the buck stops here, my member works for the chief election official. And then in the other 10 states, DC, and the 5 US territories, NASED's member is the chief election official. So in New York, the New York State Board of Elections, for example, the chief election official is the co-director of the New York State Board of Elections. And so none of our members are elected. They are the administrative professionals who implement policies, implement technologies, work with local election officials to do sort of the nuts and bolts of election administration. Like I said, I cover all 50 states, DC, and the 5 US territories. So that literally means like American Samoa and Guam to California and Texas, and literally everyone in between. And we really are an information sharing organization. So we help our members share information with each other. We help the federal government share information with election officials, and also help the federal government understand elections, because the federal government has an extremely limited role in election administration that is under the Constitution left to the states. And so there's a very limited role for the federal government. And that has grown a little bit over the last few years since election has been designated critical infrastructure, which was in February of 2017. So we do a lot of different things to help our members secure their systems, to communicate with voters, to communicate with their local election officials. But we cover a lot of ground here at NASED. And I'm grateful that it is just election administration. There's a lot of sort of other pieces that it could be, but our whole focus is election administration.
Well, I would say that that translates to me as incredibly important work for our democracy. So again, thank you. So you were talking about being in kind of an information sharer organization, like with each other, with those outside of the community. So we're here obviously to talk about the intersection between media literacy and democracy. And I know we've been working together for several years, but I think what's important for the audience and the people, listening in to know is that false information is really impacting your members. And if you could share a little bit about how that is happening and what impact it's having.
Yeah, I think false information is one of, if not the biggest issue we're dealing with right now, because it impacts literally every facet of an election official's job. It impacts the way election officials are interacting with the public. We're seeing an increase in questions, and not just sort of high level questions, but extremely nitty gritty in the weeds questions. And I want to emphasize, election officials not afraid to talk about that stuff, love talking about it. We'll keep you on the phone for an hour talking about it if they have their way. But we're seeing an increase in that sort of those kinds of questions, and those sort of interactions with voters. We're certainly hearing about a lot more skepticism from voters who are physically voting, at voting locations, who have concerns about either equipment or behavior, or individuals at voting locations. So it is impacting sort of the way election officials are interacting with voters, but it is also impacting the policy environment that election officials exist in. We're seeing across the country, red states, blue states, purple states, whatever color states you want to call it, we're seeing an increase in questions, concerns, and even proposed legislation that is grounded in false information or misunderstandings of how the election process works, and skepticism of the election officials explaining how something will work, right? It's not uncommon for legislators to not know the full weedy details, right? They have to know a lot of different subjects. But what is, I think, more unique is that there's sort of a growing mistrust of the people who are delivering this answer, or the answers. And I should say that mistrust is not specific to legislators. It is also, I think, happening among voters as well, where you see, or I hear from election officials all the time, that they spend hours on the phone with people or at events or whatever. And it's great, but sure, I trust how elections are run here, but I don't trust those people in that state. I don't trust those people in that county. If you can even get someone to the point of, yes, okay, I accept that our elections are secure. And one of election officials' most scarce resources is time. And so it's not that election officials don't want to answer these questions. We love this stuff. Truly, we love this stuff. But when you're also trying to administer an election and prepare for an election and potentially implement new policies, new legislation, it becomes just an increasingly scarce resource and just very, very difficult to navigate.
Yeah, that's one of all of what you described is one of the reasons why clearly I'm so glad that we have been working together, because, the election space is just one that to me shows the impact mis and disinformation is having on real life, in a way that a lot of, it's easy to describe. Like, this is actually what is happening in the election space because of false information. And, just so everyone knows, we've done some workshops with your members. We've done resource building and toolkit building and communication conversations. And what I thought was really interesting, and I know I've said this to you before, Amy, is that, we don't need to help election officials navigate mis and disinformation in the sense that they know what's false, right? They know how these things run, so they know when the information is false. But that there's that struggling with the communication, with understanding why constituents believe what they believe, how they communicate with people that believe disinformation. And you touched on that a little bit. But I'd love to talk to you about that strategy, like that we really dug into. Let's support election officials in understanding that, rather than identifying this is how you find election false information.
Yeah, I think it's a really important distinction because nobody knows more about how elections are administered in their state or in their local jurisdiction than the election officials themselves. So like we know it when we know it right away when it's inaccurate. But what is, I think, different about false information in elections than what we see sometimes in other fields, because we're not special, right? Every field deals with this. I think we're a flashpoint right now, but we're not special. Is that election officials are public servants, right? When you get into a conversation with your wacky uncle at Thanksgiving dinner and he's going on about chemtrails, you have the option to say, you know what? This is not a productive conversation. I'm not going to convince you. You're not going to convince me. Like, we're not going to start throwing potatoes at each other. Like, let's just back away. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, right? Election officials don't have that option to say, you know what, if we keep going, I'm going to throw potatoes at you. They have to keep engaging because they work for the voters and they are responsible for educating legislators and they are responsible for educating other in-state key audiences. And so helping election officials be able to understand who you're talking to so you can understand how to move forward, I think is a really important, it's an important tool in the toolbox of communication. I give a presentation where I have a slide that says all talking is communicating, and that sounds very basic, but it's easy to forget that like communications is not just about like what you put on your website and what you put on your social media. It's about how you're interacting with other people. And being able to identify, am I going to get this person to a place where they're going to believe the things that I say, where they're going to view me as a trusted actor, is important in understanding how to allocate your time. I mentioned before that election officials will talk about elections ad nauseum. That is not an exaggeration. My members will spend on the phone with an individual voter an hour plus explaining elections. You know, maybe in some very small places, that is a good strategy where you can spend an hour on the phone with everybody who calls to explain. But in a lot of places, that's just not practical. You can't spend an hour on the phone with every individual who calls you. And so being able to say, you know, this is, you know, like, I'm sorry that you, you know, don't believe the things that I'm saying, or I'm sorry that like we're not communicating clearly, or, you know, and being able to point them to more resources so that when that individual is in a place that they do want more factual information, they have it, like recognizing the difference between a person who is sort of misinformed versus uninformed, right? An uninformed person is open to learning more information, really has genuine questions, and the misinformed come from a perspective of, or a position of more sort of gotcha, right? I know, I'm trying to see if you know. And helping the election officials be able to navigate those conversations is really helpful. I will say one of the things that I got the most from that session in particular was understanding the different kinds of bias that are inherent, because you know, and I'm plagiarizing from you to you, but like our brains are wired to believe false information and believe conspiracies. And one of the things that I have been struck by the most is repetition bias, which is the more we hear something, the more true it seems. And I think, really, really see that as it pertains to elections. You know, I've worked in this field for over a decade. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, if you'd used the word rigged, I would have been absolutely like, what does that even mean? And now that is a word that has been used so many times that we've sort of accepted its meaning in this field. And so the more we've heard it, whether or not you believe it to be true, but we've sort of accepted its meaning in this field. And so things like, understanding repetition bias and how that sort of impacts the way you communicate with voters also, like, don't give in to the premise of the question if the premise of the question is not grounded in fact. Things like that has been really important for us. And also, as a person on the internet, the other form of bias that I think about a lot is the inherent truth bias, which is, if you can't correct everything, then the things that you don't correct seem true, inherently true. And we can't fact check the internet. That's
Right.
just not how this
That's
works.
an,
So
yeah.
I wish we could, but we can't.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. First of all, I feel like you are becoming a media literacy educator. So I really appreciate you. Are a
Well, thank
wonderful
you.
student. I love that. And I could talk to you forever, but we don't have forever. I
I know.
am going to make sure that while you're listening in on the other conversations, to think about the intersection and why you think media literacy is important for the general public and for your members. So
Yep.
I'm going to say goodbye to you for now, but I'll see you a little bit later. And I'm really excited for this next part. Obviously, I'm just excited in general, but we are bringing in Abby Kisa from Circle. I'm such an enormous fan of the work that Circle does, and I'm really excited to dive in. And Abby, thank you so much for being here. I am sorry that Sarah was unable to be here, but it's a pleasure to talk with you. We've known each other for a while, and I'm always just so interested and intrigued and inspired by the work you're all doing. So we need to start with the background as always. And if you could give us a little context about what Circle does, what your focus is, and what you do there.
Thanks so much, Michelle. I will try to step into the shoes of Sarah Suzuki, but it'll be really hard. So for those of us who aren't familiar with Circle, we're an applied research center about young people's civic engagement based at Tufts University's Tisch College of Civic Life. We're not your average academic research center, though, because we care most about doing nonpartisan research that has impact in the world, that has an impact on young people's abilities to be engaged in democracy and do so effectively. Circle was founded in 2001, actually, after a lot of research came out. And after we were founded, a lot of research came out about the inequities amongst young people in their civic learning and engagement. And so we pivoted to focus on systemic issues. And so a lot of our research takes a structural lens as opposed to individual level data. We still do that a whole bunch in civic education, but our work is often focused on really trying to understand what can help create and sustain what we call local civic ecosystems for youth, regardless of their family background, race and ethnicity, sexuality, so that we can have communities where people feel a part of the small d democratic decision making, and thus we have more thriving communities. And we usually conduct research with others, so with practitioners and with advocates often, and we really try to use the research as a result. So we're not a group that just puts PDFs online and then that's it. We're trying to talk to people.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And I don't think I've heard you articulate it that way, but that really is the distinction, right? That a lot of the work that you do is very much actionable. And I really appreciate that. And I also just appreciate the focus on youth that is so important, and especially as it comes to civic engagement and the work that you do on understanding like voting, like all the stuff you do. And I wish that we could talk about it all, but we don't have the time. But I did want to focus on some specific research that you've done that I think is really relevant to what we're talking about today. And that is something that you refer to about media ecosystems and how it intersects with youth voter turnout. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and how, what some of the takeaways are and how it might impact your thinking going forward. And I believe that we're going to share a link about this particular research in the chat so people can see it as you're talking through it.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. So At Circle, as we think about the ecosystems that young people find themselves in, we have to talk about media. We have to talk about news. We have to talk about a civic information ecosystem, right? That is not just about news. And so we tried to do this, again, taking a structural lens. We saw other researchers looking at, what media literacy education works, why, and under what circumstances. So one of the important takeaways from the research that we did is that young people across the United States live in very different media ecosystems. When thinking about the civic information implications of that is so important, because our definition of a media ecosystem not only included media outlets, like news outlets, but it also included youth organizations, other civic nonprofits, libraries, access to broadband, right? Because all of these things are critical to make that connection between media and information and action. So if we wanted to think about a media ecosystem that helps support youth civic engagement, we have to look at all these things. But they are so different amongst young people, dramatically different. And these ecosystems often have, we found 6 different represented across the country. Some of them are just a small percentage of counties, but some of them are a quarter of counties. And one of the things about those different ecosystems is that they have different strengths and challenges. So for example, one ecosystem may really be challenged by media density, right? Or other kind of civic nonprofits, whereas they may have really strong online civic culture. A lot of people in the community are using social media. But then you find others that might be the opposite. But one of the critical things that we found is that there's no one of those 6 dimensions, one of those 5 dimensions that is enough to produce high youth voter participation. Okay. So it's always a combination of those different resources in a community. It's not just media density that correlates with higher youth voter turnout. So that's one of the things that I think is really powerful as we think about where is journalism going? What is it? What is civic information and what does that landscape look like? We're just trying to put out there, here's what we're finding about what helpful media ecosystems look like for young people.
I think it's important too, because I do think that when we talk about solutions, or we talk about ways in which people are civically engaged, or or even like news avoidance, like there are all of these factors. And I think that we often try to find solutions that have just one factor, right? Like the supporting of like local journalism, or looking at the impact social media has, and instead looking at it from all of these different angles and seeing the whole ecosystem, I think is such a great, effective way to look at it. And certainly I would think is going to lead to more impactful like solutions. So it's funny because I want to quote you on something you wrote in 2018, because in 2018, you co-wrote a piece called Civic Imperative for Media Literacy. And in it, you wrote, unifying media literacy and civic engagement reinforces the reality that civic media and information about public issues exists for a purpose: expression, discussion, and informed action. Furthermore, centering the voices of youth at this intersection positions young people as civic actors, while centering media literacy as a critical civic skill. So you wrote that in 2018, and it is somewhat miraculous what has happened since then, right? So just in terms of the pandemic itself, right, happened in between these years. Tell me, has it changed your thinking on these issues? Has it made you has it reinforced it for you? How has it changed over the last 5 years?
Well, one of the things that we've been doing over the course of that 5 years is trying to understand the role of young people in civic information. What's the role of young people in news, right? And I think one of the things that's been really clear to me is that there's a lot of information and expertise that young people have that we do not leverage for civic purposes, you know? And so that's one of the things that, you know, we've been looking a lot at. What would it mean to have more youth adult partnerships related to civic information that really builds on all these experiences and local knowledge that young people have in a community, and how could that help what is going on right now in local communities with respect to journalism, for example. So that's one of the things that we've been talking about quite a bit. And the other thing that I think we're trying to put together is, you know, media are obviously a huge part of a civic ecosystem, and so is school. Both have role, and so are families and peers, and all of those people have a role in teaching media literacy. And so now I think we're just coming to a place where, you know, we need to be looking at this context in order to understand media literacy to a greater extent, right? Because someone's journey in media literacy and its relationship to civic engagement may look dramatically different if their community has low broadband access, or if their community has no youth organizations or libraries where there's youth programs, right? And so that's where I think, you know, we're just trying to think with a little bit more nuance about that relationship, and there's no one relationship between youth, media, and democracy, that it can look really different.
I love that. And I think that unfortunately, that's a difficult kind of message to get out there, right? Because so people want simpler conversations, but I think this is the conversation we really need to be having, because it is complicated. And so we need to be thinking about all of these factors. Well, I totally appreciate your time, and again, stepping in. We are going to move on to our third segment, but I'm going to bring you back for our Q&A in a little bit. But thank you so much, Abby, for being here. So next up, we are going to talk through some work that is being done in New York State. And so for part 3, I'm excited to share the screen with 2 fellow New Yorkers that are working on expanding media literacy efforts here in New York State. So we're going to be bringing on Nan Mead, who is the Director of Outreach and Communications for the Center for Educational Equity on expanding media literacy efforts in New York. Oh, sorry. I got distracted by you coming up. Let me get your title right, Nan. That would be important. The Director of Outreach and Communications at the Center for Educational Equity at Teachers College at Columbia University. That's a lot of words, Nan. And then we have Faith Rogo, who is an independent scholar and, as she calls herself, the media literacy education maven at insiderseducation.com. It's also important to note that Faith was the founding president of NAMLE, so I would not be exaggerating that we wouldn't be here right now without her laying the foundation. So there is incredible work being done in New York State regarding media literacy, I guess expansion, I would call it. And so I'm going to start with Nan, who's already ready with her slides, which I love about you. I want to talk about this Democracy Ready New York initiative that you are leading at the Center for Educational Equity. So why don't we start with sharing about it, and then we'll go to Faith to talk in more detail about some frameworks you are developing.
Sure, Michelle, thank you. And I'm realizing, even though I'm all set with this first page, I'm not sure how I will get to the second page. So
yeah,
I may actually,
love when that happens.
I may actually stop my share, but I'm happy to provide the slides later on.
No problem.
So Democracy Ready New York, we're a multi-generational, statewide, nonpartisan coalition that is committed to preparing all of New York students for civic participation. The coalition was founded in 2018 by Michael Rebell and Jessica Wolf, and is housed within the Center for Educational Equity at Teachers College. Michael is a professor of educational policy and law, and Jessica is our director of policy and research at the center. And Democracy Ready New York is the official New York affiliate of Civex Now, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with and may even be participating in as well, the coalition organized by iCivics. In terms of our approach, we take an equity-oriented, rights-based approach to creating and working towards systemic solutions. We're more policy-oriented. We also work within the legal structure. Michael is also a litigator and is perhaps best known for his initiation of the Campaign for Fiscal Equity versus the State of New York, which is a landmark piece of school finance litigation, but the implications of it really reach deep into civic preparation and participation. So after a lengthy legal process between the late 90s and early 2000s, the case ended up in the New York State Court of Appeals. And the judge ruled at that time that under the New York State Constitution, all schools are required to provide students with a sound basic education that provides the basic skills necessary to function productively as civic participants, which includes being capable of voting as well as serving on a jury. The judge also went on to talk more specifically about what are the instrumentalities of learning that are involved and in fact required in order to deliver that sound basic education. So things like supplies, textbooks, library books, computers, as well as librarians and other adequate staffing and training for those professionals. And so our work really looks at that through that lens of what are students' rights in their educational journey. In terms of our policy development, research and collective action activities, there are many, but I just want to name a handful here. Michael was the chair of the Civic Readiness Task Force that was run out of the New York State Education Department a handful of years ago. The results of that work, and actually quite a number of our early coalition members also participated in that task force. The Seal of Civic Readiness, which is a graduation pathway that is now offered in the state of New York, came out of that work and is currently offered in 350 schools across the state. Michael also authored a book called Flunking Democracy, which talks about the decline in civic education across the country. And a number of papers and research have come out of the center and the coalition. Anywhere from the level of civic preparedness that's currently going on in New York schools. And we also have advocated for legislation to allocate more funding to civic learning through the Civic Saves Democracy Act. Finally, we also organized the first annual statewide Civic Learning Week earlier this year, and we're gearing up for 2024. The coalition operates on a committee structure, and so we do have a very active and dedicated media literacy committee. And hopefully some of those
surprise me.
Yes, and I know you know who many of those folks are. And so through the course of that work, we have worked with legislators, including our assembly members, Danny O'Donnell, Linda Rosenthal, on bills to advance recommendations from some of our white papers. We put out 2 white papers prior to working with Faith. One is called Developing Digital Citizens, and the other one is called The Importance of Discussing Controversial Issues in the Classroom. And we've hosted a number of media literacy focused information and advocacy events. We see media literacy as a critical component of civic learning, not only for upper school students, but really across the P20 spectrum. And we're very fortunate in that our membership really reflects that. We have early childhood educators all the way up to classroom educators, as well as college professors and other scholars, and folks who are in the youth serving organizations as well, who are focused on things like voting and active civic participation. So with that, I want to actually turn it over to Faith, because she's really been actively engaged with our Media Literacy Committee in advancing this critical issue and its relationship to overall civic learning. So I will turn it over to Faith.
Great. Thank you, Nan. And thank you, Faith, for taking the mic.
Okay, so I'm gonna share some slides. I'm not gonna talk about the details on every slide. But folks who are looking at the recording, you can go back and kind of stop and look more carefully. I wanted to, so we came out with this document. You can see the cover of it down at the bottom there. And I just wanted to point out to people, because you can download the document, that's what the QR code is to, and you can look at these details for yourself. But here's what's a little different than I think what's happened in other places. One, that it was developed using this collaborative process. And I really just wanted to underscore that, because in other places, sometimes it's a top-down mandate thing. Sometimes it's one organization and their narrow kind of constituency, whoever that is, pushing it. This is really broad and took a couple of years, really, with lots of input from lots of different people in lots of different kinds of positions and all kinds of positions within schools. Second is that the goal of it is really to integrate media literacy throughout every school. That, as other folks have mentioned, just doing a news literacy thing or an occasional, misinformation lesson or something isn't enough to accomplish the goals that we all want to see in terms of civic readiness and civic participation. So we looked at, well, okay, so how do we create this kind of culture of inquiry across a school? And that it needs to be the job of everyone in a school who tackles this. And that because it's everyone at every level, I kept thinking of it as, we do these excellent news literacy things and excellent misinfo, and they're all for older kids. And how much deeper could they go if their media literacy education had started in kindergarten? That's what we want. So yeah. The document also doesn't just give outcomes or lesson recommendations. It articulates the pedagogy of media literacy, because how we teach is as important as what we teach in terms of our success. And this approach is student-centered, meaning we're paying attention to assessing what students gain from it, not what teachers know or how well early childhood folks keep kids away from screens, or even how much media change for this part of the initiative. That we teach from a place of intellectual curiosity and joy of discovery, instead of teaching out of our anxieties and fears. It's not dismissing the concerns. We're all doing this because we're concerned, right? But that the kind of teaching you do is different when you're teaching from a place of fear than when you're teaching from a place of embracing intellectual curiosity, right? So here's how we do this. We have created a scaffold that's based on 3 anchor skills: analyze, reflect, create. We wanted to make it simple enough that almost anybody across the state could kind of understand what it was we were talking about. We provide a K-12 developmental continuum for those anchor skills. That will be new to a lot of people, that you can really do some of this stuff in kindergarten and first grade and second grade, and then all the way up and build on them. And that came out of the awareness that in many schools, there is some media literacy education happening, but it's kind of hit or miss. It depends on, we do this in this grade because this particular teacher was interested, or they decided to adopt this one thing, but only in this grade. And if you miss it in that grade, you miss it entirely if you're a student in that district, right? So we were getting students who were either having the same lesson over and over because the people in middle school weren't talking to the people in the high school, and they were doing kind of the same thing over and over instead of extending deeper. But also some kids weren't getting anything at all. And that wasn't okay for lots of reasons, not the least of which is an equity perspective. We specifically designed the document to provide an opportunity to crosswalk these skills with existing standards. So this isn't replacing necessarily what people do. We want them to understand that what you're doing can be enhanced by integrating media literacy. And it envisions or positions school librarians as central to this work. And the pedagogy of it, we can kind of summarize here. I'm not going to spend time on this page, but that kind of description of the work up top there, that might be new to some people, that media literacy education is a multidisciplinary expansion of traditional literacy instruction that teaches students to routinely, this is about developing habits, routinely apply critical inquiry, reading, and reflection skills to all forms of media that they encounter, use, and create. So that's our kind of working statement. And then here's what we get from it. Here are the 3 anchor skills, and then each of these have kind of a detailed list of skills underneath them in the document that you can look at. And I just want
to say, I just have to interrupt you that the level of self-control I have right now, not clicking on that QR code, I want to see it so badly. So I just need to acknowledge that.
So I will show the last slide I'm going to go to. Is so this is what the developmental progression looks like. So this is for the analyze one, and a sub heading under analyze. Anchor skill is to demonstrate an understanding that all media are constructed, right? And to understand that, well, what a kindergartner or first or second grader can know is, I know that media are made by people who make choices, and choices about what to include and exclude. By the time they're elementary students, they begin to understand that it's not just that you include and exclude things, but how you present things matters. So they can begin to acknowledge that, and that those decisions influence what people take away from the media. By middle school, they understand that it's not just an influence on them. They can begin looking at the systemic things that happen, and how certain kinds of repetition can matter in their communities. And then, of course, much more sophisticated by the time we get to high school, understanding that because media are made by humans, there is no such thing as objectivity. That doesn't mean we don't examine what the perspectives are in it, but we try to determine what's relevant about those perspectives and why the choices are being made. And also some things like understanding that AI is still made by humans. Right? Yes. So that's what we mean when we talk about a developmental progression, and it goes through that for all 3 anchor skills in a bunch of different kind of specific benchmark ways.
So this is amazing, and I can't wait. I know that I've seen a draft, and we are going to share it far and wide. I wanted, a couple of questions. So clearly this work can't just stay here, right? Like, clearly we need to now, like, the charge, right, is what action takes place. So I'm wondering, from a coalition standpoint, what are we going to do with this? How are we going to get this work into the hands of teachers, into professional development, and into, ultimately New York State classrooms?
Faith and I are going to go on the road.
Okay, good. I love that. I love that.
We're going to have a virtual roadshow. We do have a very, very lengthy target list of policymakers, legislators, educators, other partners in this process. And I think we are going to spend certainly the next handful of months talking a lot about this report. The link, by the way, is in the chat. I put it in while Faith was speaking. We're going to be pushing it out on social media over the next little while. So that's really the short answer, but I'll turn it back to Faith if she wants to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think this is where the networks, like the network that is NAMLE, really plays a huge role, because I think we're pretty clear this won't work if it's a top-down mandate. And so it can't just be going to the legislature and saying, here, adopt this and make it happen, right? It has to be all of us kind of from the grassroots figuring out how it works in our own situations. And so I kind of look forward to people taking a look at it and then letting us know if you implement pieces of it, how it's going, so that we have those reports we'll compile the reports, we'll kind of keep track of things. But having those stories actually from schools, from classrooms, and no matter what state you're in, because I think a lot of this applies across states. That continues to build the evidence that we all need when we're talking to policymakers or administrators or your building principals saying, I really want to do this, right? That's what I'm kind of hoping in part will come of it.
Yeah, it's interesting because, we talk all the time and to each other and to others in our community about, how do we get practice from here to there? Like, how do we scale it? How do we get it to more students, to more teachers? And it feels like this type of work is a key part of that, right? Is to have this framework that can be shared. And so my kind of last question before you bring on the other panelists is for you, Faith, in terms of, do you clearly you write this specifically, but are you thinking about the scaling capability? Are you thinking beyond what you're working on, and you're thinking more broadly on that bigger goal of getting media literacy to every school? How are you thinking about it?
I have always thought of all of this as a grassroots organizer. It's like you start from where you are, and it might start, and this is kind of why positioning librarians to do this in a major way, I think, is important. At least in New York State, they're mandated to have librarians in every school. We know that's not the reality on the ground every place, but that means there's somebody in every building, or should be somebody in every building, who could be a spark for this, and who would have the kind of knowledge base to begin to do it. It's also very much an approach that is structured in a way where any teacher at any point in the journey, the media literacy journey they're at, could find usable stuff here and begin to do it. So you start with what you are, and it'll go from there. And that's why we built it to be able to work with doing a crosswalk. So you're a science teacher, look at the science standards for your state or your district that you already have to do, and see where the matches are, and write your own crosswalks. Don't wait for somebody else to do it.
Love that. Oh, well, thank you so much. I mean, I'm a proud New Yorker, and very proud of all the amazing stuff that's happening in our state. And I can't wait to continue to dive in and figure out how NAMLE can support this work, and how, we take that grassroots challenge, because I think it's so vital to the efforts to scale. So thank you for being here. I would love to bring Amy and Abby back. Nan and Faith, you're not going anywhere. Because I'd like to continue the conversation for these last 10 minutes or so with everyone. Nice to see you. So, one of the things that I do want to talk about, and I think I am going to put Faith on the spot just to start the conversation, because I don't know if I've ever even asked you this question, and I'd love to know kind of what you would answer if someone just directly asked you, what is the connection between media literacy and democracy? How would you answer that question?
That democracy can't work without informed voters. It starts there for me. That's not the full picture of the discussion, clearly. And that informed voters doesn't just mean, okay, I know that my opinion on this particular policy issue, or I know that candidate is running and I'm going to vote for them. I think this notion that of informed democracy needs to be paired with this idea that, and we are in community together. And I hope it's a vision of a pluralistic community. So it's valuing those, and that I think what we give short shrift to in media literacy is that if you're doing it the way we describe it, one of the things that students build are discussion skills and listening skills. And so in addition to logic and reasoning and finding what it allows you to do, the way I describe it is find your common ground in the use of evidence rather than in your position. You don't need to agree with the person that you're talking with. What you need to agree on is that common ground everybody has a logically based evidence thing, and that we come to some kind of agreement of what counts as evidence and what doesn't.
Thank you. So I want to just go to the rest of you on this, the broader connection between media literacy and democracy. And Amy, I wanted to specifically ask you, you and I met X amount of years in a random, years ago in a random congressional briefing. And, you knew media literacy was important. And I'm wondering how you feel on, like, again, the broad level, why media literacy is important to the work that you're doing and to kind of making those connections, not only to your members, but to the general public.
For me, it's about, we have to be able to understand what we read and understand what we consume. And it's not about necessarily the facts on the page. It's about what isn't on the page, who's providing that message. And that to me is where this intersects. Election officials can talk till we're blue in the face, and certainly I can too, as you heard earlier. But the media is a key player, and I use media in the broadest sense of that word. And the media is a key player for voters and the general public understanding election administration. And because election officials can't be everywhere all the time, and the public and people of all ages need to be able to see look at what they're consuming and understand it from both what's in here, what isn't here, who is telling me this, who isn't here, what aren't they telling me, where can I get more information. Those sort of additional steps are, I think, really important to a basic fundamental understanding of how elections are administered and where our work dovetails so nicely together.
Love that. Abby, Nan, do you have any, I have some specific questions, but I don't know if you have any thoughts just in general that you want to share about that intersection between media literacy and democracy.
Just quickly, I'm drawn to this idea of developing the soft skills, right? So Faith alluded earlier to speaking and listening, and extend that out to really being able to exchange ideas without being rude, without being nasty, without being offensive. I mean, we turn on our TV every day and we see the effects of rhetoric, negative rhetoric, and poor communication. So I like the fact that we can use media literacy awareness to keep those skills at the fore, because I think they're really important and critical to advancing as a society, learning how to work with one another across all differences, all kinds of differences that we have.
Abby, I was going to ask you, just in terms of the intersection with democracy and media and just the work, that you've seen, just like what Faith is working on, what the Democracy Ready Coalition is doing, the research piece, and how important that, that is part of it. I'm wondering if you'd speak a little bit about the importance of research in the context of these conversations.
Thanks so much, Michelle. One of the realities, or one of the things that we've really been struggling with, is the relationship between civic information and action. And, there's general research about that. But as we get into this world where there's hundreds of types of civic information, different channels for it, different ways of communicating about it, we have to dig into that to a greater extent to get a little bit more nuance in, okay, if we want people to use media and use civic information for action, then what does that look like? Because we've made too many assumptions about that for too long. And the research that we've done, actually, that some analysis that Sarah did, really found that it's more complicated, right? There's sometimes local dynamics that affect what we do with digital information and, you know, what we hear from other people. And so that's one of the areas that I think we just have to dig into a little bit more if we really want to solidify this relationship between media literacy and small d democratic practice.
Wonderful. Well, I
Can I
love
jump
to
in for a
end-
second on
Of
that?
course,
Just to
please.
say, and that's why it is so important to have a media literacy model that can be customized for your local situation,
Mhm.
right? That's really a key. It's why we don't offer a scripted curriculum, for instance, right? That we have to have that flexibility in there.
Yeah, love that point. Okay, so I love to end sessions with like the magic wand question. So we're gonna fast forward 5 years. We're gonna make it 5 years. What would you like to see? Like your vision, if you could look into the future 5 years from now, in terms, obviously there's lots we would want to see, but we're focusing on media literacy and democracy right now. What magic, like what do you want to see in 5 years? Who wants to take that one?
I'll take it. It'll sound
Thank
kind of flippant, but I actually would love to see it happen, which is that the federal Department of Education and every state Department of Education would have set aside millions of dollars for staff development money. And every education school in the country would have an endowed chair in media literacy.
I love those. I hope someone in the backstage took that down. Yeah, we need to get on that. Okay, what about you, Nan?
I think, so in a lot can happen in 5 years. I think,
As we know.
yes, I think in terms of, so my hope, of course, is that one of the bills we've been supporting the last handful of years actually gets passed.
Love that.
That would not only, I mean, there's a few things that we want, right? We want librarians in elementary schools. That grade band hasn't really received that guarantee yet in New York. And media literacy standards and professional development, as Faith suggested. I mean, I think we're really at a critical juncture where we must provide training to our professionals in schools, not just librarians, but all content teachers on media literacy.
Great. Abby, and then we'll let Amy have the last word.
Yeah, I mean, I firmly believe that K-12 schools are really important, but I'm gonna try to add something different to the conversation by saying, by saying that, you know, I think that there's some really exciting things happening that connect civic information sources like news outlets to their communities to build that stronger relationship there, right? So people understand, where does civic information come from? Oh, it might come from me or my neighborhood. I may participate in bringing that together. So I think that we can kind of think about our major civic information sources, news outlets, as much more partners with communities, rather than something that's outside and distinct that you can't know, right? Because when you know something, you're much more likely to trust it, usually. And so that's one of the changes that I think has started, but needs to be furthered, especially with respect to young people.
Great. Thank you for adding that. Amy, take us home.
That's a lot of pressure.
Yeah, mic drop moment, Amy Cohen.
Obviously, I come from a different perspective than everyone else on the panel here, but for me, I would like to see, you know, voters in 5 years be better consumers of information and be using some of these skills that they're hopefully learning in their schools, but also in other venues, because there's a lot of people who are aged out of the education process. I would like to see voters be better consumers of information, and therefore be more informed participants in the election process. That doesn't mean not asking questions. That doesn't mean not having a political point of view, but that does mean coming into the process with a respect for expertise and the people who are administering the process, the people who are doing the day-to-day of election administration. I would like to see that, and I would also like to see some of those hopefully media literate people grow into the election professionals of tomorrow, because we need people to participate in every sense of the word. We need people to be voters, and we need people to be engaged in their communities, but we also need people to be poll workers, and we need people to be local election officials, and we need people to work in state election offices. And I think the way we do that is by starting at the bottom and building trust over time. And so that's my sort of 5-year plan, but it's maybe more like 10 to 15.
Amy, you'd be happy to know I'm in the process of completing my poll worker training.
That
Yay.
thrills me. I am
I am
delighted.
so excited about it. I'm scared though, because that's a really long work day, but I think I can do it.
You can do it.
Thank you all so much. I'm sorry we didn't get to the question. We are at time, but we will take that question and see if we can get some answers for you. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to leave you with where we started, which is today, to be democracy ready, all students must be media literate. And I'm going to just say all humans must be media literate. Thank you, Faith and Nan and Amy and Abby, for taking some time out of your week. Please continue to support Media Literacy Week. We have more events coming today, lots of community events over the next 2 days. Thank you all for being here, and enjoy the rest of your day.